The wind didn't speak in whispers at Dunn Ranch. It howled. Long, drawn-out sobs that twisted through brittle fence posts and rattled the tin roof of the old barn. Dust danced like spirits in the air, swirling in eddies around the porch where Caleb Dunn sat every morning, coffee cooling in a chipped enamel mug clutched between scarred hands. He stared at the endless stretch of ochre hills, where dry grass clawed at the earth, and nothing moved except the crows overhead. The ranch stretched for miles, but to Caleb, it had shrunk down to this: an empty porch, an old chair, and a silence so thick it had taken root in his bones. He rose with the sun and worked until the sky burned orange. There were no ranch hands anymore, no laughter in the kitchen, no voice humming old hymns as the bread baked. Just him, and the cattle, and the past. Every day began the same. Feed the horses, check the pump by the east field, mend whatever the wind had torn apart during the night. Some days, the tasks took him 10 hours. Some days, 3. But he kept doing them, not because they needed doing, but because the motion filled space the silence could not. Behind the ranch house stood a single twisted juniper tree, older than the house itself. Its roots curled like fingers over a small patch of earth, marked with 2 wooden crosses. Caleb had carved the names into them himself, long ago. Sarah Dunn, Baby Dunn. No dates, no epitaphs, just names. He didn't need the rest. He remembered it all anyway. Sarah had been everything he wasn't. Warm, forgiving, the kind of woman who could grow roses in the desert and make strangers feel like family. She died in that very house, screaming into the cotton sheets as their child was pulled from her too soon. The midwife had cried harder than Caleb had. He hadn't known how. Still didn't. The baby hadn't lasted a week. He stopped visiting the graves after the first year. Now he passed them like one passes a familiar stone on the path, acknowledging their presence, but knowing they wouldn't speak back. It was on a Wednesday, the kind that smelled of heat before noon, when he decided he needed supplies. He strapped the saddle to his mare, Dusty, and rode into Bristow with a list that only had 3 things but would take him half a day. It was the first time he'd been into town in over a month. Bristow hadn't changed. The same leaning storefronts, same crooked saloon sign creaking in the breeze, same shopkeeper behind the counter who nodded like he didn't quite remember Caleb's name, or maybe just pretended not to. People in Bristow didn't ask questions when a man stopped talking. They just started whispering instead. As he tethered Dusty outside the general store, Caleb caught sight of a small crowd gathered near the water trough. Men mostly, with whiskey breath and sunburned skin, hollering and laughing. Something ugly curled in his stomach. He didn't want to look, didn't care. But then he heard it. "I'll let her go for 20. Hell, 15. Just give me a bottle and she's yours." Caleb turned. In the center of the gathering stood Earl Tanners, drunk as a preacher's confession and swaying like a fence post in the wind. His face was sunken, red around the eyes, and he held a half-empty bottle like it was a trophy. In front of him stood a girl. She was thin, barefoot, with matted brown hair hanging to her shoulders like wet straw. Her dress might have been white once. Now it was the color of old paper, torn at the hem. She didn't flinch when Earl shoved her forward. "Deaf as a post," Earl spat. "Useless. Just eats and stares. Can't even cry right. Ain't that right, girl?" The girl didn't respond. Her eyes were downcast, fixed on a pebble by her bare toes. Someone in the crowd snorted. Another one mumbled, "Christ, Earl." Caleb stepped closer, barely noticing his feet moving. $10, Earl slurred. "Come on. Hell, I'll throw in her blanket." Caleb had never been one for drama, but something about the way the girl stood, unmoving, like a post carved from wood, did something to him. Her silence was too complete. Not fear, not resistance. It was the kind of silence a man knew when he'd buried too much. The kind that grows in you like mold. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded stack of cash. Not much, but more than Earl deserved. "I'll take her." The laughter died instantly. Earl blinked, swaying, not quite believing what he'd heard. "Wah. Yeah, hell, all right then." He pushed the girl forward like a sack of grain. "She's yours. Good luck." Caleb didn't look at the crowd. Didn't speak. He simply reached down, took the girl gently by the arm, and led her to Dusty. She didn't resist, didn't even lift her eyes. He lifted her onto the saddle and climbed up behind her. She sat stiff as a fence rail the whole ride back. Not a word was spoken on the trail. When they arrived back at the ranch, the sky had turned a pale amber, the wind cooling. Caleb dismounted first, helped her down with careful hands. She was so light he could have carried her with one arm. He led her to the house, opened the door, and pointed toward the spare room. She stepped inside, like a ghost, touching nothing, saying nothing. He watched from the doorway as she sat down on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes never met his. "You hungry?" he asked. She didn't move. "I'll leave some bread and water outside the door." He closed it gently. That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, staring at his reflection in the lantern glass. He wasn't sure if he'd done something noble or stupid. The townsfolk would assume the worst. Let them. He hadn't saved her. He didn't think in terms like that. But he hadn't walked away either. The next morning, the bread was gone. She didn't speak. Not the next day, or the one after. She came out only to sweep the porch or fetch water. She kept her eyes down and her steps soft. Caleb didn't press her. He didn't ask questions. He left meals by her door and taught her the routine without words. Where the firewood was kept, how to feed the horses, which fence posts needed checking. Each day she moved a little faster. She never smiled, never made a sound. Once, while mending a saddle, he dropped a wrench on the floor. It clanged hard against the wood. From across the room, she didn't even flinch. He wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unnerved. Days turned to a week. Caleb adjusted to her presence the way a man adjusts to a missing tooth. He noticed the absence less and less. The house, though still quiet, no longer felt hollow. She swept the porch in the mornings before he woke. She folded her own blankets. Once he came in from the field to find the kettle already boiling and biscuits set out on a plate. She never said a word. The townsfolk would have said he'd gone mad. Maybe he had. But something shifted the day he caught her staring at the graves behind the house. He'd been oiling the hinges on the barn door when he saw her, standing motionless by the old juniper, hands clasped in front of her. She looked like a statue carved from dirt and sorrow. Caleb walked over slowly. She didn't turn. "They're mine," he said quietly. "Wife and son. Long time ago." Still, she didn't move. He cleared his throat. Didn't have a name for the boy. He wasn't. He didn't make it long enough to need one. She lowered her eyes. Caleb walked away. That night, as the wind rattled the window panes and coyotes howled in the distance, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. Soft crying. It came from the spare room. Muffled, gasping. He stood outside her door, hand resting on the knob, but didn't enter. Didn't knock. He stood there until it stopped, then returned to bed. He didn't sleep. The days grew shorter. Autumn approached. The air grew sharp in the mornings. Caleb found himself speaking more. Still not much, just simple things. "You did good on the fence." "Thank you for the firewood." She never answered. But sometimes he thought he saw something in her eyes, something that flickered, like an ember refusing to die. He still wasn't sure if she truly couldn't hear, but he was beginning to suspect otherwise. And if she was pretending, he didn't blame her. Whatever had silenced her had done so for a reason. And Caleb Dunn, ghost of the Dunn Ranch, knew better than anyone that sometimes silence was safer than the truth. The wind never stopped at Dunn Ranch. It crawled beneath door frames and whispered through cracks in the walls. It sang lullabies to no one, carried voices long dead across open plains, and reminded those who remained that silence was not peace. It was just another kind of noise. Caleb had learned to live with it. Most days he didn't even hear it anymore. But now there was another silence inside the house. Not a threatening one. Not even uncomfortable. Just quiet. Soft. Present. It followed the girl wherever she went. She moved like a shadow. Careful. Deliberate. Always watching the floor. Never the sky. He still didn't know her name. He hadn't asked. It had been 3 weeks since Bristow. She hadn't spoken a single word. He wasn't sure she even could. When he asked if she wanted more food, she didn't nod. When he left a pair of boots by her door after noticing her blistered feet, she didn't take them until the next morning. And when he caught her staring at the graves again, she simply turned and walked away. But he noticed things, the way she avoided the windows when the sky turned gray. How she jumped ever so slightly when thunder rumbled in the distance. The way she flinched, not visibly, but just enough to betray her, when the crows screamed overhead. For a girl who was supposedly deaf, she reacted to a world of sound. And that planted a seed in Caleb's mind that wouldn't stop growing. He watched her from a distance. Not because he didn't trust her, he didn't even think about trust anymore, but because something didn't sit right. There was a carefulness to her, a kind of rehearsed quiet, like someone used to being hunted. One afternoon, while splitting logs behind the barn, he called out to her by mistake, "Hey, can you bring the water bucket over here?" He didn't expect an answer. She was on the other side of the fence, picking weeds from the vegetable patch. Her hands paused for a fraction of a second. Then she continued, as if she hadn't heard a thing. But Caleb saw it. That pause. That slip. He tried again the next day, tossing a tin cup onto the floor behind her when she sat by the fireplace. The clang was sharp, sudden. Any normal person would have flinched. She didn't move. She was good, too good, and that meant one thing. She wasn't deaf. She was pretending. He didn't confront her. He didn't even feel angry. If anything, he felt something strange blooming under his ribs. Pity. Maybe even admiration. It took effort to stay silent for so long. Purpose. And fear. He started leaving his journal open at night, ink fresh on the page. He knew she was curious. Once or twice he found the pages slightly out of order, as if someone had read through them and tried to put them back exactly the same. He wrote as if someone was reading now. "Don't worry. I won't ask why. I know what it's like to pretend you don't feel things. Sometimes it's the only way to survive." She never responded. Not in writing, not in words. But the next day, he found her cleaning the old saddle in the barn, not because it needed cleaning, but because she'd seen him glance at it the day before. It was the one Sarah used to ride. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, and watched her for a long time. "You ever ride before?" he asked gently. She didn't turn. "I'll teach you," he said. "Not now, but one day." She dipped her head slightly. A movement so small it could have meant nothing, but to him it was everything. That evening, the sky turned dark early. Heavy clouds gathered like bruises, and the wind shifted from dry to cold. Caleb knew a storm was coming. He secured the barn doors, tied down the tool shed, and brought the horses into the stall. When he returned to the house, he found her already setting candles in each room. She moved like she'd done it 100 times. When the thunder cracked, she didn't flinch, but her hands tightened around the candle just slightly. That night, the power of the storm shook the roof. They ate in silence, the only sound the clink of forks against tin plates. Rain hammered the windows like fists. He glanced at her. "You scared of thunder?" She stared at her plate. He tried again. "My wife used to be. Said it sounded like God was dragging furniture around." Still nothing. Then, very slowly, she lifted her head. Their eyes met for the first time in days. She didn't speak, but her eyes held something new. Recognition. He nodded once and went back to eating. The next day, he found her kneeling by the fire, sorting kindling. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife slowly. "Had a dream last night," he muttered. She didn't look up. "My son was alive. Looked just like Sarah. Dark hair, big eyes. Must have been 5 years old in the dream. He asked me if I was going to die too." He paused. The knife made a slow drag against the whetstone. "I told him I already did." The fire crackled between them. Her fingers stilled over the pile of wood. "I know that don't make sense," he said, but it felt true. She lowered her head. He didn't speak again for the rest of the day. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if he left her behind. If one day she just walked off into the prairie and never came back. Would he chase after her? Would he let her go? Began Vi. He never found the answer. The leaves began to change. Whatever green remained in the grass turned brittle. The air smelled of smoke and dry hay. On Sundays, he rode out to check the water lines. He'd taken to teaching her hand gestures, not signing, but simple ones. Pointing, nodding. She understood him. That much was clear. But still, she did not speak. One morning, he watched her from the porch as she stood near the corral, watching Dusty trot in wide circles. She leaned against the fence, fingers drumming slowly against the post. Her body was relaxed for once, unclenched. He couldn't remember the last time she looked so still, like she belonged to the land instead of just surviving on it. He joined her. "She's gentle," he said. "Wouldn't buck even if you kicked her hard." She didn't reply. "Don't think you'll ever talk, will you?" He didn't say it mean. It was just a fact. She turned to him, just for a moment. Her eyes were bright, alert. Then, without a sound, she climbed the fence and dropped into the corral. He started forward, ready to stop her, but she raised one hand. Then, slowly, she approached Dusty. One careful step at a time. The mare stood still, ears forward. The girl raised her hand and let the horse sniff it. Then, without looking back, she laid her head gently against the animal's neck. Caleb exhaled. He felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't known was still clenched. Later that night, as he sat at the kitchen table writing in his journal, he paused before the last sentence. "I think you're more afraid of your own voice than the men who made you hide it." Then he left the journal open and went to bed. The next morning he found the page turned. Beneath his last line, in shaky pencil script, someone had written, "You might be right." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he closed the journal slowly, tears welling for the first time in years. And he whispered into the empty kitchen, "You don't have to be scared here." The sky turned copper by noon, and the sun hung low, like it too had grown tired of watching the land suffer. October was thinning out what was left of summer's breath. The wind that once whispered through the tall grass now cut straight through bone. On the edge of Dunn Ranch, the fence line buzzed with dust and dying weeds. Somewhere beyond the hills, a howl rode the wind, but neither Caleb nor the girl looked up from their work. She was wearing the boots he'd given her now. They were still too big, flapping slightly when she walked, but she wore them anyway. Caleb had noticed the way she moved more confidently, less like someone expecting the ground to fall away beneath her. She'd even started brushing Dusty in the mornings without being asked. She still hadn't spoken again since writing in his journal, but something had shifted. There was a quiet rhythm to things now. He'd stopped thinking of her as the girl in his mind. He still didn't know her name, but she had a presence now. She existed in the house, not as a ghost, not as a burden, but as a weight that anchored things. The door clicked differently when she passed through it. The floor creaked in new spots. The place had come to life again, just slightly, like a long, frozen stream cracking open beneath the ice. One morning, Caleb came in from checking the water troughs and found her making coffee. Not just pouring it, brewing it, the way Sarah used to. The smell brought him up short, arrested him mid-step. For a moment his breath caught in his throat, and he stood in the doorway, unable to move. She didn't look at him. She poured a cup and slid it across the table before sitting in her usual spot by the stove. He sat across from her, fingers curling around the warmth of the mug. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. For the first time, Caleb noticed the faint scar running along the line of her jaw, like something sharp had grazed her years ago. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't healed smooth either, just another mark this world had left on her. He didn't ask. 2 days later, he heard the riders. He was out by the southern field, hammering a loose post back into the hard dirt, when the sound reached him. Hooves, maybe 4 or 5 horses, moving steady. Too steady to be neighbors. No one came out this far without a reason. He squinted toward the ridge. Sure enough, black shapes moved against the pale sky, growing larger by the second. He dropped the hammer and moved fast, cutting through the tall grass and back toward the house. The girl was hanging laundry. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He caught her eye, and whatever she saw in his face made her freeze. "Inside," he said. "Now." She didn't argue. He bolted the front door after her, grabbed the rifle from behind the cabinet, and positioned himself near the window. The riders were approaching slowly now, their movements deliberate. Dust kicked up around them like smoke. When they came into view, Caleb counted 5. 3 had badges, though they looked unofficial, the kind you buy with favors instead of honor. 1 wore a wide-brimmed hat with a feather tucked into the side. He dismounted first, swagger in every step. "Afternoon," the man called, voice loud and cheerful. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle across his chest, but not yet raised. "What do you want?" "Name's Barlow," the man said. "Got myself and my boys here doing a bit of work for the county. Looking for a man named Earl Tanners. Might have passed through this way." Caleb didn't flinch. "Never heard of him." Barlow smiled, showing yellow teeth. "Tall fella, greasy, bad with cards, worse with temper. Word is, he had a daughter with him. Young, brown hair. Pretty thing, though quiet as a grave. You sure he didn't pass by?" Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "This is Dunn Ranch," he said. "Ain't no Tanners here." Barlow looked around lazily, pretending to admire the barn. "We heard from a few folks in Bristow someone took a girl off his hands. Said he sold her like livestock." He looked back at Caleb. "Awful, ain't it? Shameful." Caleb didn't blink. "Not my business what drunks do in town." Sure, Barlow said, nodding. "But see, here's the thing. That girl, she saw something. Earl Tanners put a knife in a man's gut back in Lead Hollow. Witnesses say she was there. Now, we don't normally get too stirred up about low-life killing low-life, but this one was a friend of the marshal. That makes it our concern." "I still don't know what that has to do with me." Barlow stepped closer. "We think she might have come this way. We'd like to look around." Caleb's voice dropped. "You ain't got a warrant." Barlow grinned. "Ain't got one. Ain't askin'." Caleb raised the rifle slightly, not aiming yet, but enough to stop the man in his tracks. "Then this conversation's over." Barlow's smile thinned. "You a hero, Mr. Dunn?" "No." "You think she's worth dying for?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "I didn't say she was here. But you didn't say she wasn't, either." The 2 men locked eyes. Behind them, the other riders shifted in their saddles, hands near holsters. Finally, Barlow stepped back. "All right," he said, chuckling. "No need for blood, not today." He tipped his hat. "But if you see her," he added, voice low now, "you tell her she's got a choice. Either she speaks or she disappears like the last one." They rode off slow, deliberately, like they wanted him to know they weren't in a hurry. Caleb waited until their dust had settled before going back inside. The girl was in the corner of the kitchen, hands clenched, eyes wide with terror. He lowered the rifle and sat across from her. "I don't need to know what you saw," he said. She didn't move. "But you need to know something," he said. "They'll be back." She nodded. He reached for the journal and slid it across the table. A pencil rested beside it. She stared at it. Then, slowly, she opened it to a blank page and wrote a name. "Lena." He looked at her. "That your name?" She nodded again. He took a breath. "All right then, Lena. You're not deaf. I knew that already. But now I know your name." "That's something. Maybe that means we can talk. When you're ready." She didn't answer. But she didn't close the book either. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the shadows flickering on the walls. Somewhere outside, a coyote yipped. The wind moaned under the eaves. He thought of the men, their smiles, their threats. He'd killed before, during the war and after. He didn't want to again, but if it came to it, he would. For her. Lena. A name now. Not a shadow. Not a ghost. And as the fire crackled and his eyelids grew heavy, Caleb knew the time for silence was ending. Whatever storm was coming next, it wouldn't be made of rain. The silence in the house was no longer just quiet. It was pressure, like the hush before a fire breaks through the wood. Lena didn't pace, didn't speak, but her every step had urgency in it now. She moved like someone measuring exit points. Her eyes drifted to the windows more often. Her hands clutched the edge of her dress even when she wasn't thinking. Something in her was starting to buckle, and Caleb could feel it like a storm in his chest. He didn't press her. He never had. But she was running out of room inside herself. Whatever truth she'd buried, whatever horror she carried from the man who sold her, from the death she witnessed, it had begun to rise. Caleb kept his rifle closer now, not because he feared the men would return. They would. That was certain. But because he knew the first shot might be his only warning. There would be no second visit where they asked nicely. He'd started sleeping less, taking shifts at the window, the barn, the rise above the house, watching dust trails, reading the horizon like scripture. And every time he looked back at the ranch, he saw her silhouette in the window, waiting, breathing like a cornered doe, ready to vanish at the first crack of a twig. But one night she didn't wait inside. He came back from checking the perimeter and found her sitting on the porch, knees pulled to her chest, eyes staring up at the stars. The wind moved through her hair in gentle strands, and her bare feet rested on the old wooden planks like she'd done it 100 times before. He paused at the bottom of the steps. "You cold?" She shook her head. He stepped up, sat on the other end of the porch, a quiet distance between them. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was just the space they both needed to stay whole. "I remember thinking stars looked like bullet holes once," he said after a while, when Sarah died. Felt like the sky'd been shot through, like God didn't care to patch it. Lena's eyes didn't move. I'd sit out here for hours, talking to her under my breath, begging her to come back, telling her I'd fix things if she just gave me another chance. He exhaled slowly. She never answered. A long beat passed. Then Lena said, barely above a whisper, "Did you stop asking?" The voice struck him like a blow. He turned his head slowly. Her face was unreadable, but her voice, it was cracked glass, brittle and trembling, as if it hadn't been used in years. But it was hers, and it had weight. "No," he said gently. "I just stopped expecting an answer." She nodded, eyes still fixed upward. "I used to talk to my mother after she died," she said. But she was already far away before the coughing took her. I think maybe she was too tired to listen. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. After she was gone, it was just him. Earl. He drank more, got meaner, stopped calling me by my name, just called me Thing. Said I was an echo. Said I didn't need a voice if I had no one to talk to. Caleb said nothing. Lena wiped at her eyes. "He killed a man in Lead Hollow, right in front of me, stabbed him with a broken bottle, then said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I'd forget what breathing felt like." She turned her head toward Caleb now, for the first time fully. "So I stopped talking. I stopped hearing. I became nothing." Caleb's jaw clenched, not out of anger toward her, but rage at what had been done. "You're not nothing," he said quietly. "Not to me." The wind picked up again, cooler this time, pulling a shiver across the porch. "I didn't want you to know I could hear," she said. "Because if you knew, then someone else might find out. And if they did, "They won't," he cut in, "because I'll stop 'em." Her face didn't change. "I mean it," he said. "Anyone comes here looking to harm you again, they'll have to walk through me first." She swallowed hard. "I'm tired, Caleb." Her voice shook now, soft and small. "I don't want to run again." He nodded. "Then you won't." They sat there, under the battered stars, until dawn began to melt across the edge of the earth. She didn't speak again, but she leaned her head gently against the post beside her. Caleb didn't move. He just listened to her breathing, the first honest sound she'd made since arriving. The next day, he rode into town. He didn't tell her where he was going, just saddled Dusty, packed the rifle, and left before breakfast. Lena watched him from the kitchen window, the way someone watches a man ride into danger. Because he was. Bristow was quieter than usual. The saloon hadn't opened yet, and the streets were dusted with dry leaves and silence. Caleb made straight for the telegraph office. Inside, a wiry man in suspenders glanced up with a slow, bored blink. "I need a wire sent to Bo Cartwright," Caleb said. The man scribbled something. "Where's he at?" "South Branch of the U.S. Marshal Circuit. Last I heard, he was in Hidalgo County." "That's a far reach," the man muttered. "You payin' for priority?" "Yes." He handed over a folded bill. "What's the message?" Caleb leaned in. "Need your help. Bounty hunters coming. Girl's the witness." She spoke. "Can't run. Come fast." The man whistled low. "That kind of trouble." Caleb just stared at him until he nodded and started tapping keys. Caleb left without another word. 3 days passed. Lena returned to silence, but it was different now. Not the kind that hid. The kind that waited. Each night, Caleb sat on the porch again. Sometimes she joined him. Sometimes she stayed in the doorway, just near enough to feel the comfort of not being alone. On the 4th night, headlights crested the ridge. Caleb stood, hand on the rifle, breath already shifting to steel. But it wasn't Barlow. It was Bo. The man stepped from his dusty vehicle in full martial blues, his mustache thicker, his shoulders broader than Caleb remembered. "Took you long enough," Caleb muttered as they clasped forearms. "Had to shake off a tail," Bo said. "Barlow's men been sniffing around Hidalgo, too." They stepped inside, and Caleb introduced Lena. Bo removed his hat and nodded solemnly. "I heard what happened in Lead Hollow," he said gently. "Heard you saw it all." Lena looked down. "I did." Bo pulled a folder from his coat. "If you testify, we can lock him for life. Maybe get those dogs off your back for good." Caleb stepped forward. "But we need to move fast. Before they come back." "They already did," Bo said grimly. "Broke into 2 houses near the state line. They're desperate now. Word is, Earl's offering a bounty on his own daughter." Lena's hands clenched. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll testify." Caleb looked at her, something heavy and proud in his chest. "You sure?" Bo asked. She nodded. Bo placed the folder on the table. "Then we leave at dawn." That night, Lena didn't sleep. Neither did Caleb. He sat in the old rocking chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, heart pounding like it hadn't in years. In the stillness before sunrise, Lena approached him. She crouched beside the chair and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He looked down, eyes misted. "Thank you for coming back to life." Outside, the first light peeled over the land like hope stretching its limbs. They were ready, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. Dawn came with a breathless hush. No wind, no movement. Just a pale blue-gray glow leaking over the horizon, slowly spilling across the cold dirt of Dunn Ranch. The kind of morning that felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Lena stood by the door with her arms wrapped tight around herself, a worn satchel hanging from her shoulder. Caleb stood nearby, fastening the saddle straps on Dusty. Bo Cartwright adjusted the revolver on his hip as he watched the land like a man who'd spent too many years waiting for things to go wrong. No one said much. Words weren't needed anymore. The truck waited near the barn. Bo would drive Lena halfway to the city line, then change vehicles, then disappear. The route had been mapped out like a military maneuver. 2 days of travel, followed by a closed-door meeting with a federal marshal, and then her testimony in court. If everything went right, Earl Tanners would never see daylight again. If everything went right. But Caleb knew better than to believe in smooth endings. Bo climbed behind the wheel. Caleb helped Lena into the passenger seat. As he closed the door, she caught his hand. Her grip was firm, trembling. "Will you be here?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Every damn day." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Then she reached up and wrapped both arms around his neck. It wasn't a child's hug. It wasn't fear. It was something fierce and quiet, and full of every word she hadn't said all those weeks. Caleb didn't move for a long time. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice didn't shake. "I don't want to forget this place." "You won't," he said, "and it'll never forget you." Bo started the engine. Caleb stepped back and watched the truck roll out through the gates, tires crunching gravel, kicking up dust that clung to the light like memory. Lena looked back only once, just as the road curved behind the rise. She raised her hand, slow and steady. He raised his too. Then they were gone. Caleb turned and went back inside. The house was still, too still. The silence was no longer comforting. It pressed against his ribs like weight. He stood in the doorway, staring at her empty cup on the table, the dent in the chair where she always sat. He almost called out her name, just to fill the space, but stopped himself. Instead, he sat down and picked up the journal. He flipped to a blank page and began writing. She left this morning, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She's braver than most grown men I've known, and smarter. I think she'll make it. I hope she'll make it. He paused, tapping the pencil. I'd burn this whole damn ranch to the ground if it meant she could live without fear. He put the pencil down. That night, he didn't light a fire. He sat on the porch long after dark, listening to coyotes in the hills, counting stars. The next morning, a bird hit the window. Caleb jerked awake in the chair and found himself clutching the rifle across his chest, heart racing like it used to during night patrols back in Tennessee. It took a minute to remember where he was, who he was. The house felt hollow. He forced himself into the routine, feeding the horses, checking the fence, boiling water for coffee he barely drank. He didn't write in the journal again for 3 days. On the 4th day, he found boot prints near the well. Small ones. Too small for his. He crouched low and brushed away a layer of dust, still fresh. He didn't draw the rifle. Not yet. Just stood, slow and wary, and scanned the edge of the property. Nothing. But the air had changed. That afternoon, while tending to the barn door hinges, he heard the sound. Hoofbeats, not galloping. Slow, deliberate. He grabbed the rifle and stepped around the barn, muscles tensed. Then he saw her. Lena, on horseback, alone. Her hair was longer now. She wore a proper coat, buttoned tight at the collar. Her boots were new, but dusty. There was a bag strapped behind the saddle, and her hands, though gloved, clutched the reins with confidence. Caleb lowered the rifle, stunned. She guided the horse right up to the porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. He stood still, as if a sudden movement might make her vanish again. She smiled. I said I didn't want to forget this place. Caleb stared. You rode alone, she nodded. Bo dropped me off near St. John. I borrowed this mare. Traded a pocket watch for her. He exhaled slowly. You could have ridden. I didn't want to ask. Ask what? She met his gaze, if it was okay to come back. He stepped forward and took the reins from her gently. This place is always yours. Lena looked around the ranch, the barn, the hills beyond. A warmth moved behind her eyes. Earl's gone, she said softly. 20 years, no parole. They offered witness protection. I said no. Caleb's chest tightened. I'm done hiding. He nodded once, then twice. His throat felt tight. I made soup, he said, almost awkwardly. She smiled wider. Of course you did. They sat at the table that night and talked. Not much, but enough. Lena told him about the courtroom, how her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word, how the judge looked at her like she mattered, how she wore a ribbon in her hair, because her mother once said ribbons were for brave girls. She told him she thought about Dunn Ranch every time she closed her eyes. Caleb listened without interrupting, spoon halfway to his mouth, heart as full as the room had once been empty. That night, she sat by the fire while he read from a newspaper Bo had left behind. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't expect anything. But she stayed. The next morning, she fed the horses before he got outside. By noon, she had cleaned the saddle room and organized the tool chest. By evening, she took Dusty for a ride around the south pasture. The sun dipped low, setting fire to the hills. When she returned, Caleb was chopping wood. She approached slowly and said, "I want to build something." He leaned on the axe. "Like what?" "A school," she said, "for girls like me." Caleb blinked. "There's land east of here, unused. We could fix it up, paint it, get books." He studied her face. "You sure about that?" "I've never been more sure." He smiled. Then he nodded. They began planning the next day. The land didn't protest. The sky didn't mourn. The wind still came every night, curling through the cracks and singing its long, lonely song. But inside the house, there was warmth again, and light, and laughter. And sometimes, after the chores were done and the stars were out, Lena would sit on the porch beside Caleb and tell him stories. Not about the past, but about what she dreamed for the future. He listened to every word. Because her voice was no longer made of fear, it was made of home. In a world where pain often speaks louder than words, and silence becomes a shield, it only takes one act of quiet kindness to begin healing. Caleb Dunn didn't rescue a girl. He gave her space to reclaim her voice, and Lena, in return, reminded a broken man what it means to live again. From dust and despair grew trust, from fear bloomed courage, and from two lost souls, a new kind of family was born. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. It sometimes rides in quietly on tired horses, wearing old boots, carrying hope in its saddlebags. If you've felt the heartbeat of this tale and believe in the power of love that rises from the ashes of sorrow, saddle up and subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles. Don't miss the next unforgettable journey across dusty trails, hidden hearts, and timeless romance. There's always another story just over the ridge, waiting for you.